church once again. It's really good to be here and see all of you. I used to see you guys once a week, but it's been about once in 2 more than that years now. I see Anoop and Karen at the gym, which is good. They're keeping up their levels of fitness. But all of you, the rest of you, is nice to see you again. Shall we open with one more word? Just thank you, Jesus, for this day that you've given us. Thank you for the opportunity that I have to speak. I pray that you please calm my nerves, help me to say everything at a good pace. Help me not to mix up the words, to say things the way that you would wish me to say them. Help me as well to learn from this message to apply to my own life. And please forgive me if I failed you anything, which is Amen. Right, so let's reading taken from Ephesians chapter 4, all right? 4 verse 31 and 32. And from that, what would you think today's message is on? Anyone? You all read the scripture you with me?
Being kind to one another.
Oh, thank you, Brad. Okay. That works. I'll take that for now. Okay. We're going to start off with a story. A story from a lady called Patricia or Tracy Whiteside. Tracy Whiteside can still remember the people who acted so insensitively to her and to her 3 ailing children all those years ago. There was the doctor at the National Institutes of Health who wrongly insisted that her second child didn't have the same disease as her first. The neighbor who suddenly stopped permitting her son to hang out with the Whiteside's boy. The fellow diner at the place in Bethesda who wouldn't stop asking Whiteside and her husband intrusive questions at the worst possible time. All of them she cannot forget. All of them she cannot forget. When Whiteside, 85, and her husband Daniel, an official with the US Public Health Service, bought their first house in the Washington area in the 1960s, they picked a red brick colonial in Delmont Lane in Bethesda. It was just a mile from what was then the National Naval Medical Center, where all 3 of her children were being treated for cystic fibrosis. Cystic fibrosis is an incurable disease that debilitates the lungs. The indignities were infinite. How the Whitesides had to lay their kids on blanket-covered wooden board slanted downwards so that they could clap their children's backs to help release the lung mucus. How, for research purposes, hospital staff photographed her son Kemp naked at all angles, focusing the lens on his misshapen chest despite his exhausted state. But Whiteside never expected the small cruelties from other people. How could a doctor, one at the NIH, no less, dismiss out of hand Whiteside's suspicion that her second child had the same disease as the first, delaying the treatment that may have prolonged the 8-month-old's life? He was arrogant, Whiteside said. When he was wrong, he never apologized. How could her neighbor stop allowing her son to play with Kemp, the shaggy, blonde, blue-eyed boy who was obsessed with space and music, who collected records and cassettes, and memorized lyrics and dreamed of becoming a disc jockey? My neighbor apparently didn't think it was good for her son to see Kemp, Whiteside recalled. He was getting more gaunt. By 1970, all of her children had died. Leslie at age 4, Donna at 6, and finally Kemp was 8 years old. Shortly after the Whitesides became childless and began giving away toys and clothes, they visited that same place on Wisconsin Avenue. At the end of the meal, a man at the communal table peppered them about children. How many do you have? 9. Really? Why not? Shouldn't you be doing something? He kept pushing us, Whiteside recalled. His wife kept nudging him to stop. The Japanese couple just kept looking at us with sympathy. We left and got in the car and talked about how awful it was. She didn't let the wounds eat away at her. She buried her children and eventually found a way to keep going, selling real estate and helping run a soap opera merchandise company. In 2017, her husband Daniel died. But Whiteside, who now lives at Norwood, a retirement community for military families in the Chase section of the district, never forgot that people should have known better. To forgive, she said, would feel phony. To forgive would dishonor her pain and her children's. To forgive would sap her of her resolve to know that she and her husband did what they were supposed to do. They did everything that they could. How many of you have experienced a similar type of pain? Maybe not to the same extent, but where forgiveness seems to be acknowledging that the other person was right. Forgiveness seems to be letting go and saying that what has happened doesn't matter. Does that feel like forgiveness to you? Is that what forgiveness really is? By a raise of hands or a show of hands, how many of you have been wronged by someone else? A lot of us, right? If not all of us. We have all been wronged in some way. Some by people that knew that they were doing wrong, some didn't know, but either way it felt just the same. Not by a show of hands. Just think about it. But how many of you have been the one being the wrong person? I know that I have. Many of us have been wronged by people, but many of us have also been the bad person in another story. But forgiveness, we can all admit, is difficult. Forgiveness is extremely hard. The difficulty to forgive increases the more that something means to you. If Brad came to me and he said, listen, I can't pay you back the 2 rand that I borrowed to buy the popsicle, I could forgive that debt because it's not that much of an impact. But if Brad came to me and said, hey, I know I took all of last month's salary, but I can't pay that back now, that would be a lot harder to forgive. Right? So what is it? What does it mean to forgive? Well, according to the Merriam-Webster dictionary, it says that it means to cease to feel resentment against an offender. To cease to feel resentment against an offender. There are 3 words or 3 parts that I want to acknowledge. Number 1, to cease. It doesn't mean that that happens just by itself, but that's a choice. You cease to feel. A lot of us are still caught up on the things that have happened to us previously because that makes us feel it. But what this is saying, that means that we should give it up. We should cease to feel resentment about an offender. It doesn't mean by acknowledging that or by forgiving that person that it wasn't offensive. It doesn't mean that that thing goes away. But it's to cease to feel resentment towards that person, even though they did you wrong. There are different types of forgiveness scenarios. So, number 1, we already mentioned. When someone has wronged you knowingly, intentionally, when someone has broken your trust, when someone has lied to you or lied about you, when someone has hurt you by insulting you, or they've gossiped around about you, or they've betrayed you. The list goes on. Right? There are many ways that people can hurt us. Then there's the way that people have unknowingly wronged us. Somebody cut you off in traffic. They didn't care about your feelings, they were just worried about where they were going. When someone comes across as rude, when they didn't really mean it in that way, they were just having a tough day, but that made you feel that they were wrong. When someone did something that hurts, but they didn't really know that it hurt. There have been times when we've wronged someone, and there have been times when we have wronged God. Forgiveness in each of these aspects is very important. When someone forgives you knowingly, or when someone wrongs you knowingly, we forgive them and we try to reconcile. When someone has wronged us unknowingly, going up to them and saying, you've done this wrong thing, and now I forgive you. Sometimes it doesn't have the same effect that we hope it. But by forgiving them, it helps us to be at peace, to have a better wellness in terms of our life. When we have wronged someone, we seek forgiveness. When we wrong God, we seek forgiveness as well. Bonus point is forgiving yourself. Some of us, we have done some very bad things in the past. We've hurt people. We've done things that we regret doing. And the person that we've done wrong to may have forgiven us. God, we ask for forgiveness and He's forgiven us. But yet we still feel this burden, this weight, because we have not forgiven ourselves. We should have known it. We should have done it. Is it easy to accept forgiveness when you have done something wrong? Is it easy for you to accept the forgiveness of another person? Yes? No? I think it's relatively easy. When I've done something wrong and I go to someone and I apologize and they say, I forgive you, I'm like, good, thank you. Is it easy to forgive when someone has wronged us? Is it easy to offer them forgiveness? Not as much. So let's focus on this last point. Is it easy to forgive? And for that, we turn to Matthew chapter 18, verse 23 to 35. You can all turn with me there. Matthew chapter 18, verse 23 to 35. And it reads, Therefore the kingdom of heaven is like a certain king who wanted to settle accounts with his servants. And when he had begun to settle accounts, one was brought to him who owed him 10,000 talents. But he was not able to pay. His master commanded that he be sold, with his wife and children and all that he had, and that payment be made. The servant therefore fell down before him, saying, Master, have patience with me, and I will pay you all. Then the master of that servant was moved with compassion, released him, and forgave him the debt. But that servant, that very same servant, went out and found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 denarii. And he laid hands on him and took him by the throat, saying, Pay me what you owe. So his fellow servant fell down at his feet, like he did, and begged him, saying, Have patience with me, and I will pay you all. And he would not, but went and threw him into prison till he should pay the debt. So when his fellow servants saw what had been done, they were very grieved, and came and told their master all that had been done. Then his master, after he had called him, said to him, You wicked servant, I forgave you all that debt because you begged me. Should you not have also had compassion on your fellow servant, just as I had pity on you? And his master was angry, and delivered him to the torturers until he should pay all that was due to him. So my heavenly Father will also do to each of you from his heart, if from his heart he does not forgive his brother his trespasses. That story sticks with me quite a bit, and I think of many scenarios that are likened to that, that don't mean as much. But one scenario in particular reminds me of when my parents used to pick me up from school. So I used to go to Carlstown Secondary School, and there was one entrance, one exit. And when all the parents and the transport people came in to pick up their kids, the place would be crowded. Parking lot would be crowded. But once everybody has the kids, everybody's bathing and they want to get out. They want to exit that one gate. So what does everybody do? They try to squeeze behind one another. Even if you came in last, you try to quickly enter or quickly exit, even though you were the last one, you should follow the line. Everybody tries to cut in front of one another. Similarly to me, this reminds me of when I'm sitting in traffic. And when someone gives me a gap, and I carry on down the road and I see someone else wanting a gap and I say no. That person is not getting a gap from me. I just got in. I'm going. Doesn't that sound familiar? When someone gives you the opportunity, but you don't afford that same opportunity to someone else. In this chapter, in Matthew chapter 18, the master forgave his servant the debt. The debt was 10,000 talents. The debt that he didn't forgive his servant was 100 denarii. Do you know what those figures are in this currency today? I assume not, because it took me a while to figure it out myself. So 1 denarii is 1 day's wage. Okay? And if we go off South Africa's daily per hour rate for the minimum wage, that's 21.69 per hour. Times that by 8 hours, and then times that by 100, that's 100 denarii, right? That would be 17,352 rands. Okay. Quite a sum. So that's how much he didn't forgive his servant. But the amount that the master forgave him was 10,000 talents. 10,000 talents is equivalent to 60 million denarii. What does that look like in rand if we work off that same daily wage? 10,411,200,000 rand. His master forgave him that debt. How much could you buy with all of that? What would you have done to accumulate that much of it? But his master forgave him that, and he wasn't able to forgive the 17,000 that he owed, or that his servant owed him. Secondly, the fact that he had a servant meant that he was in a better place than the servant was, which is why he had such a great debt. But he couldn't forgive that servant for that. The second way we can calculate this is with the inflation rates. So it's not just that 17,000 or 10 billion. If you calculate with inflation rates, 1 denarii is actually $32. Times 100, that equals 48,687. That 60 million is 29 billion rand and a whole lot of change. The sum that he was forgiven was 600,000 times more than the sum that he did not forgive. That's how great it was. He didn't emulate that forgiveness at a lower cost. What is this story teaching us? Well, the servant that was forgiven, he forgot, or he was ignorant of what the master had done for him. In the same way for us, when we have been forgiven by God for this great debt, our lives, for all the sins that we've done, we haven't just sinned once, we have messed up time and time again. We've accumulated a similar debt. He's forgiven us greatly, but against our brother or sister that owes us just a little bit, or that has wronged us in just a very small way compared to the way we've been forgiven, we cannot forgive. God has forgiven us for the greatest debt possible. Do we think that we're better than God to hold that above someone else's head? Have we forgotten the people that we were? That we once also needed forgiveness, not from God, but from other people. Have we forgotten the grace that was received? Have we not had true appreciation? Have we not repented? Do we not have real gratitude for what God has done? And have we not changed our behavior since then? Do we take the forgiveness that we get for granted? Lesson number 1, coming from this passage. We can find this lesson in Matthew chapter 6, verse 14 to 15. For if you forgive men their trespasses, your heavenly Father will also forgive you. But if you do not forgive men their trespasses, neither will your Father forgive your trespasses. So that means that even if we come to church every Sabbath and we put in our tithes and offerings, even if we are kind to the people at work and we are taking care of our families, if we're doing everything that we are supposed to be doing, but we have not forgiven the people that have wronged us, and they have sought forgiveness from us, if we have not forgiven them and we hold grudges against them, how is God expected to forgive us? The lesson: you have been forgiven of the debt of sin and welcomed into God's kingdom. We have no right to hold another sin over them. Lesson number 2. The past has passed. Forgiveness can only be issued for things done in the past. We can't forgive someone for the things that they are going to do in the future, because that hasn't happened yet. In the present, if it's happening right now, it's very difficult to forgive because that event hasn't passed. We can only forgive them once that has happened already. We or they have messed up, but we justify it for ourselves. Why? We say, we were different people. We were different back then. That was another lifetime. That was when this happened, and I was going through a tough time. We made mistakes. Isn't that how we justify it to ourselves, to others? And isn't that how we justify it to God as well? When we kneel down after the 10,000th sin, the same one that we kept doing over and over again. We say, but God, I was stressed. I was going through a tough time. I couldn't handle it. But forgive me, and I won't do it again. We afford ourselves that much grace. But when it comes to another person, no. That's not the past. That's who they are right now. They will continue doing that forever. If I forgive them, it's not going to do anything. But for ourselves, it's a past life. It's an entire lifetime from which we can be recreated, purified, and made anew. Shouldn't we afford people that same grace? Shouldn't we look at them and say, okay, that was the past, but you have asked for forgiveness, I should forgive you. You have asked for forgiveness from God, and He's forgiven you. Why do I still hold it against you? Shouldn't we also acknowledge that the same recreation, reformation that we can undergo, other people can undergo as well? Lesson number 3. We often excuse ourselves and say, we're different. God doesn't understand what it feels like to forgive these people. The amount of hurt they put me through, the amount of tension they put in my family, the difficulty that I've experienced pitching up at church and everybody looks at me a certain way. We excuse ourselves and we say, God doesn't understand what that feels like. But He does. In the story that we just read, the Master understands more than any of us what it feels like to forgive someone their debt. He doesn't just forgive for the piece of candy that was stolen or the lie that you told. Jesus died for the ugliest of sins. Think about the ugliest of sins that you know. The ones that tear families apart, that break people down, that leave them in a destitute condition. He died for those sins. He died for the worst of sins, the hardest truths to accept. He died for those, the hardest ones to forgive. He's forgiven. Shouldn't we also seek, at least, to be like that? Back to lesson 1. If God has and can forgive them and us, who are we to hold it against them? Now, forgiveness is a choice. It isn't something that just happens spontaneously, miraculously. It's a decision on your part. It's a decision that mostly affects your well-being. Sometimes the person that's wronged us is out there living their best life. They're carrying on like nothing has ever happened. Sometimes it's because they've also forgiven themselves, but you still hold on to that hurt. You still hold on to that hurt and that heartache, and it brings you down. But that moment in time has passed completely. That moment in time is no longer here. That's why some people can carry on like they could, because they've sought forgiveness from God as well. But us not forgiving them, it's holding us back. It's holding our weight. It's a weight that's holding us down. It's the choice of parking off or slowly driving through a terrible hailstorm. It's the choice of seeing either the clouds parting ahead and you can see that there's no rain on the road. It's the choice of seeing the shelter nearby, but saying, no, I won't drive slowly. I won't drive carefully. The shelter is 100 meters away, but I won't go there. I better park off there. And when the hail beats the car down and breaks the windshield and it damages the car in so many ways that the insurance won't pay out, so many ways that we can't afford. We excuse it and we say, no, I could not do it. I could not drive the 100 meters. I could not drive where the sky is clear. I could not drive slowly there. Admittedly, it's easier to park off the car. It's easier to stay and be a victim to the hailstorm that has happened. It's easier to stop where we are and accept our fate. But it's more difficult and more worthwhile to travel to the shelter, minimize the damage, to travel out of the hailstorm so that we don't undergo that damage. To give up our choice of forgiveness is to become a victim. We, by accepting where we are and not choosing to move forward, we make ourselves prey to those burdens. Forgiving within the church. Some of us have had our own issues within the church itself. I was reading an article on why in Seventh-day Adventist churches so many people leave. It turns out that for the very small part of it, the part that's argued the most, it's based on doctrine. Very minimal, very small percentages because they disagree with something that is taught. It's a very small part. Why do people leave? Because they were hurt by it. Because someone didn't forgive them, or they chose not to forgive someone who wronged them. Why do they leave? Because the pastor did something to them. The pastor said something to them. A church member approached them and said, hey, you're not dressing that way. Don't come to church looking like this. Or you didn't return your tithes and offerings. Don't you know what God expects you to do? A church member has come to them and said, what you're doing in your family at home isn't right. And it's hurt them. That's the reason why most people leave the church. But what is the one way that people return to the church? By reconciling. When people have approached them and forgiven them, when people have approached them and sought forgiveness, when people have sought to make relationships right, people have returned to the church like that. That's the number one reason for people leaving the church, and it's the number one reason for people returning. Forgiveness, forgiveness. When we choose not to forgive a brother or sister that has hurt us, we don't admit that we may be the one that was wrong for the lost relationship. It results in the following. This is a quote done by, this is a quote from a journal on the same thing, unforgiveness in the church. Unforgiveness among individuals in a congregation leads to the ultimate breakdown of relationships and disruption of the health of the congregation. The ability to forgive mistakes and to seek to mend fractured and frayed relationships is vital for the survival of any congregation. There's a man by the name of Cecil. He was a bishop in the 1st century. In the 1st century, the church was undergoing persecution. The church was being persecuted for their beliefs that the government didn't see as right, but more so that certain authoritarian figures didn't see as right. So, what were they doing? They were seeking them out, killing them off, martyring them. We have three groups that were within the church at that time. There was number one, the Confessors. The Confessors were people that admitted or stayed true to their beliefs and they professed their faith. Unfailingly, they chose to stay within the church and they said, we are Christians, we believe what we believe, and we're not changing it. Those were the Confessors. The martyrs were simply confessors that were killed for their faith. They stayed till the death. Even though they were persecuted for it, they chose not to give up what they believed was true. Then there was the lapsed. Those were people who, fearing the persecution, fearing being martyred, they left the church. They left the church and they did what the government asked. They went to give sacrifices at the public altar. Or they bought certificates to say that they did sacrifice even though they didn't. They were people that wanted to blend in with the community and they basically left the church behind. Now, Cecil, the bishop of Carthage, he was faced with this dilemma. What do we do with the lapsed people? What do we do with the people that have gone out? They've either sacrificed at the altar or they bought certificates to say that they have. What do we do with these people? Do we accept them straight away? Do we forgive them? Or is there something else that needs to be done? Well, this is what he said. If they purchased certificates that said that they sacrificed, but they didn't sacrifice, we should reinstate them immediately. So we can forgive them. They didn't do it, it was a bit of a forgery thing on their part, it was fraud, but it's fine, we'll forgive them, we'll accept them. They didn't go to the altar, they didn't sacrifice, we can forgive them for that. But if they sacrificed, they would only be readmitted into the body of the church on their deathbeds. If they sacrificed, and there happened to be another time for them to prove themselves sincere later on, let's say another persecution, if they prove themselves worthy in that persecution, then we can admit them back into the church. Does this sound like what God does for us? And do we ask the same of people? Do we say that only when they're dying Only when they're on their deathbeds, we'll go make right with them. Do we say that only if they prove themselves worthy, and this happens to a lot of us, only if they prove themselves worthy, we'll put them on a probation period, or we'll put them under trying circumstances once again. Only if they prove themselves worthy, then we will forgive them. Does God only forgive us under these terms? No, he doesn't. Therefore, we should forgive in the same manner in which we have been forgiven. So what is not forgiveness? Forgetting. Forgetting is not forgiveness. I only forget what is not important. Darren comes to me and he asks for that 2 rand. I forgot about it. That happened years ago. I didn't even remember until he brought it up. It wasn't that important to me. It's not the full weight of what forgiveness is. Forgiveness is not excusing. Forgiveness is not saying, okay, you did that wrong thing, but you don't have permission to do it again. That's not forgiveness. Forgiveness is acknowledging that they did the wrong thing, and you admit that they could possibly do it again, but you accept and you reconcile and you bring them close. You say, I forgive you for what has happened. I have faith and I hope that you won't do it again, but I'm going to treat you as if you will never do it again. Forgiveness is not denying. It is not saying, I'm unwilling to face the pain of an injustice done. It's not saying that Anoop came to me and he did a bad thing to me, but in my mind I'm like, no, he didn't do that. Anoop didn't do that to me. I can't accept that he's done that. That's not forgiveness. Forgiveness is acknowledging that something was done wrong. Forgiveness is acknowledging that Anoop may have offended me or I may have offended him. Forgiveness is not condoning. It's not saying there is no excuse for your bad behavior. Forgiveness is not pardoning. Pardoning is what Cyprian did to his church back in the 1st century. Pardoning says that there are consequences for your actions. Pardoning is saying you have to serve a sentence. You have to show us and prove to us that you are worthy of being readmitted into the church, that you are worthy of being forgiven by me. Forgiveness is reconciling, and it takes 2 people to make that work. What are the benefits of forgiveness? Well, let's start off with what it is not. When we have an unforgiving spirit and a resentful spirit, we hold on to chronic anger. Research, clinical studies have shown that there's an increased risk of depression, that there's an increased risk of heart disease, there's an increased risk of diabetes, there's an increased risk of anxiety, hostility, and it correlates, holding those things within us correlates to the major psychiatric disorders that we see in the world today. Forgiveness, where we forgive people, according to a number of studies, one of which you can find on John Hopkins, the website, the medical school. Forgiveness decreases the amount of stress that we have. Forgiveness decreases the risk of heart attacks. It decreases and it balances our cholesterol levels. It decreases the amount of pain that we feel. It decreases our blood pressure. It decreases the anxiety, the anger, and the depression that we experience, if we experience any at all. It increases the sleep, the quality of sleep that we have, the duration and the quality of the sleep that we have. Forgiveness increases our optimism in life. Looking back, we keep looking back, and like Uncle Daniel mentioned last week, if we have our hand to the plow and we keep looking back, the plow goes skew, right? If we keep looking back, we'll crash and burn. If we keep looking back, we won't make it very far. It's okay to look back in the rearview mirror, that small thing once in a while, to acknowledge that's where we were and this is where we've come. But keeping the plow and keeping our hand to the plow, keeping our eyes straight ahead, that helps us to be more optimistic, that what lies ahead is better than what has happened. It increases our feelings of happiness, our experience of joy. And it increases our overall satisfaction in the way we perceive our lives. When we forgive, there are very, very real physical and mental benefits that can that can happen. Now the methods, that is the last part to touch on. The methods of forgiveness. Number one, don't keep track. That verse and that concept of forgiving someone 70 times 7, 490 times. Was that a literal number that we should only forgive them up at that point? No. It was to forgive them in a way that, listen, so many times, it's fine. We cannot recall, we don't keep score. We don't recall that this person has done this to me so many times. That Jace kicked me 8 times on the field over the past 2 years. I don't keep track of those things. No, I'm joking. But we don't keep track of the wrongs that were done to us. That's what that is about. Does God keep track of the wrongs that we have done? No. He forgives us and he wipes our slate clean, as if we had never done it in the first place. So don't keep track. Secondly, there has to be a spiritual transformation to let go of the hate, the envy, the jealousy, and anger that we experience. Galatians 5, verse 20 to 21 speaks about the acts of the flesh, speaks about what the flesh experiences. Without submitting to the Holy Spirit, without submitting to that transforming power, you will continue to live in that hate, envy, jealousy, and anger. Spiritual transformation needs to happen to replace that with love, with joy, peace, and long-suffering. Forgiveness isn't easy. It takes long-suffering. It takes dealing with that sometimes daily, sometimes hourly, sometimes thinking about that for years on end and working through that and saying, no, I love this person. This person has been forgiven and I forgive them. No matter how difficult it is for me, I will accept that and I will treat them as if they've never done it in the first place. Third, put yourself in their shoes. Don't put yourself in their shoes in a prideful manner and say, if I was in that position, I would have done much better. That's not it. When you put yourself in their shoes, what you're doing is saying, if I was in that position, how would I like to be treated? And not just that, when I was in that position, how did I want to be treated? And then treat them accordingly. Flip the narrative and realize that you also have fallen short and that you also require forgiveness. Oh, good. Write it out. Journal it. Write a letter. Get it out of your system in that way. Don't go out to them and say, hey, you did all of these wrong things to me and I'm forgiving you and I'm a better person for it. That doesn't feel right. Write it out. If you need some person to talk to, if you need someone to express it, if you want to let go of all that's happening inside of you, sometimes it's not best to always contain it. Sometimes it's not easy to just suppress it and say, the past is the past, let's carry on. Write it out. Journal it. Write a letter. You can, even if you're not a writer, if you want to speak your mind, voice note it. Your phone has that ability. Go to your voice note app. Don't go to WhatsApp. Don't send it to anyone. Go to your voice note app. Record a voice memo. Speak about what you're experiencing. Speak about it and speak about it to God. But at the end of that, don't express all of your anger and say, well, I'm right for feeling this way. End your letter, end your voice note, end whatever it is with saying and acknowledging that you are going to forgive this person. When that is done, don't send it to anyone. It's not about you sending it to that person and saying, this is all the wrong that you've done to me. I've kept all the score and I forgive you this much. No, that's not it. This is for yourself. Let go of it. Second last, think back and contemplate. Reflect on the times that you've been forgiven. Reflect on the time that you've been the one in the wrong. Reflect on the times when you sinned against God and you sought forgiveness. Once you do that, you realize, I'm really not that great after all. And then it will be much easier to forgive someone their debts. I want us to turn to Philippians 4, verse 8. Some of you know this verse by heart. Anyone does? Philippians 4, verse 8. Yeah, that was very soft. But it's probably right. The way you were, I could see something. Seemed about right. Okay, Philippians 4, verse 8. Finally, brethren, whatever things are true, whatever things are noble, whatever things are just, whatever things are pure, whatever things are lovely, whatever things are of good report, if there is any virtue and if there is anything praiseworthy, meditate on these things. It is not good to look back and meditate on all the bad things that have happened. That is in the past. It's in the past for you and I, and it's in the past for our neighbors as well. Think on the good things that God has done for you. Think on the lovely things that He's doing for you. And Matthew chapter 6, verse 14 to 15. If your heavenly Father has forgiven you, you should extend that same forgiveness to others. May God bless you, and may God help you as you seek to reconcile your relationship with others. Thank you.
So, shall we turn to Untitled Chapter 9? The next one.
We